Welcome to part 2 of how to build Cthulhu. Today, we'll be covering how to craft the Triton and how to sculpt the body. And like always, don't forget to subscribe if you like what you see. Let's get right into it. Let's start with the Triton. I'm pretty sure I got this from a fruit platter. I'm not really sure anymore. I thought it would make a great base for the Triton though. I use skewers to make it look a little bit more menacing. I use crazy glue and baking soda to glue it together. I also end up adding a skull from Citadel. I first use hot glue and then use crazy glue and baking soda. I feel like the plastic was too flimsy, and so I add another crafting stick for support. I just use hot glue for this one. I wanted to add something more to it since it was Cthulhu's Triton. I wanted there to be a tentacle wrapped around it. I used thick string for it. I started adding hot glue and wrap it around starting from the bottom. I do this in small sections of about an inch at a time. I don't think I achieved what I set out to do, but I like the end result regardless. I primer it using Black Magic Crafts Mod Podge mix. I do 2 coats. This way, the string becomes very solid. After that, I just use hot glue to attach it to Cthulhu. Oh, and quick shout out to Craftnex for coming up with the name Cthulhu. When I work on the fingers for this hand, I actually end up building around the Triton. I use the same techniques as before. The big difference is that I bend the wire to grip the Triton. I go back and forth to make sure that they're in the right pose. I then wrap it up in aluminum and add hot glue to it. I poke a hole in the hand and stick the exposed wire of the finger. Make sure to add crazy glue and baking soda to all the joints for the fingers. I also try to model the hands just a bit with the hot glue. Let's get to the most interesting part of the build. And no, I'm not talking about the muscles, it's the material I used. I took this opportunity to test out the differences between paper mâché, Crayola's cheap air dry clay, and Polyform air dry clay, which is a little bit more expensive. I did not bother testing Model Magic because I felt like this is not what its purpose is. I like to use it more for terrain than miniatures. We'll get to the pros and cons of the material, but first, some tips on the muscles. Making the muscles might be easier than you think. I would suggest going online and looking up muscle anatomy. From there, you simply break down the muscles into round blobs. So for example, the chest is just 2 round blobs. Add a thin layer of clay and try to blend the edges. If you would like more definition on certain areas, just add more clay and blend. For the chest, I make sure to not blend on the lower section, so to create an exaggerated definition. Make sure to add a bit of water to the sculpture where you plan to put the clay. When you blend, add water to your fingers to make the blend seamless. If you apply this same technique and way of thinking, I'm sure that you'll be able to do what I do here. You might need a bit of practice, but I'm sure anybody can do this. You have to try to get better. And to get better, you have to make some mistakes along the way. The idea is to learn from the mistakes and not be discouraged by them. Let's talk about the material. Let's start with paper mache. Beginner tips. don't use big chunks. Once your surface dries, it becomes extremely difficult for the center on thick blobs to dry. Sometimes it really doesn't even dry. There were parts of this where I had to cut open sections because it wouldn't harden. The way to fix this is by doing thin layers and allowing them to dry before adding the next one. It was honestly the best option for the tentacles. On long parts like this, clay might be a little bit too fragile. Paper mache dries and stays together better long term, and it's also very cheap. There is not much to add in terms of detail when it comes to paper mache. It's very good for specific textures like rocks, waves, and things like that. It's not something you can manipulate like clay. It's always better to work with the material instead of working against it. Don't try to make it do something it simply just can't do. I was surprised on how easy it was to work with Crayola's air dry clay. This clay is a good cheap option for sculpting. It's easy to shape and manipulate. My favorite thing about it is that I can use it as my foundation for the pieces. It does have its flaws. It does take a little bit longer to dry, but it's not to the point where it becomes a deal breaker. The issue with this clay is that it cracks a lot. So be prepared to go back and do some fillings on these projects. Polyform clay has to be my new favorite clay to use on any of my projects. I used to like DAS, if you remember from earlier videos. Polyform model clay is my new standard. I have to this day not experienced a crack on me. The only con for me is that it is a little bit more expensive, but it's worth it on my end. This is the clay that I'm actually using to fill up any of the spots and cracks from the previous clay. The way I cut down on cost on big projects like this is to use the cheaper clay as my base, and then I do the final layer with the more expensive clay. As you can tell, there isn't much left to do here. All I'm doing is adding thin layers of clay to fill in all the gaps. I'm also exaggerating some definitions here and there. All that's left to do is drill where the Cthulhu wings will go, or where the Kraken chains will go. It goes without mention that whatever size craft sticks you use for the wings, also make sure to use those as the stakes for the chains. Thank you very much again for watching this episode of Franky D Crafter. If you like what you see, you know what to do. If you want to stay updated on any upcoming projects, subscribe. I'll catch you on the flippity side.